Okay, so I would like to first thank you all for joining us this evening. We are very excited to see that we're over 200 people registered for this event, and whereas we might not get all of those people logging in as these things happen, we're super excited about hosting this, and we think it's an important and timely subject. And this definitely promises to be a thought-provoking discussion. My name is Michael Emmons, and I'm the Assistant Director at the University of Delaware's Center for Historic Architecture and Design, also known as CHAD, and I will be the moderator for tonight's program. And we feel that these discussions are more important than ever, since historical monuments have clearly become stand-ins or focal points for much larger culture wars that have escalated in the US over the past couple of decades. As underscored by last night's presidential debate and the reactions to it, it seems like now more than ever, there are sharply diverging opinions among Americans about who we are as a people, what American citizenship means, and what the future for our country should look like. And this year especially, historical monuments seem to be emerging as almost literal battlefields for these divergent ideologies to play out their culture wars physically and materially in public spaces. And it's this dynamic that led to the title for our event, Monument Wars. But make no mistake, we see tonight's event not as a way to escalate, but instead to work towards diffusing these tensions to find common ground and mutual understandings about monuments. While we give people another couple of minutes as I see people are continuing to log on, I'll just go over the agenda for this evening and discuss how the Zoom webinar will work. In a second, we'll kick things off with a short welcome from our co-sponsors, followed by introductions and opening remarks from each of our expert panelists. We will then move into a roundtable discussion with questions from myself as moderator. And then lastly, we'll open the virtual floor, so to speak, for questions from anyone in the audience. Please note that in this Zoom webinar, the only people visible or audible are our panelists. Questions from the audience should be submitted using the question and answer function, which you should see on your Zoom menu bar. It's that button that says Q&A. My colleague, Kate Morrissey, will be sorting through these and asking the questions on your behalf. Feel free to submit your questions anytime during this program, though they will not be discussed until the final segment. And lastly, I want to point out that tonight's discussion is being recorded, and it will soon be made available on the Preservation Delaware website. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Chandra Reedy, who is the director of CHAD, and after her, Mike McGrath, the president of Preservation Delaware. Chandra?
I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our panelists and all the attendees tonight. I'm the current director of the Center for Historic Architecture and Design, known as CHAD, which was founded back in 1984. We're a research and public service unit housed in the Joseph R. Biden Jr. School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Delaware. CHAD works with communities in Delaware and throughout the Mid-Atlantic, doing projects that involve research, survey, and documentation of historic properties and landscapes, preparing nominations to the National Register of Historic Places, working with the Scenic and Historic Byways programs in Delaware, aiding local heritage tourism efforts, and documenting and studying traditional cultural materials and technologies. One of our signature programs is the Mid-Atlantic Historic Buildings and Landscape Survey. Through that program, the CHAD staff have documented thousands of historic structures, and we're currently in the process of digitizing all of that documentation so that it'll soon be made freely and publicly available through 2 web-based portals at the University of Delaware. We're excited to be able to facilitate tonight's important discussion about Delaware's historic monuments. We operate a graduate certificate program in historic preservation, and the introductory course, which is being taught this semester, has a week entitled Monument Wars, which is what inspired the name for this roundtable. However, we're actually thinking about this event tonight more as a peace-creating discussion rather than a war. We're very pleased to be partnering with Preservation Delaware, Inc. for this event. What I personally find most exciting about the current national and local controversies about historic monuments is that they bring an infusion of passion into reflections of the past and how the past still affects the present. And they also bring new and diverse voices from local communities into the discussion of historic preservation issues, which I think is extremely healthy for the future of our field. So I welcome all of the participants who will be expressing their ideas and viewpoints here tonight. And now I'll turn things back over to Michael.
All right, thank you, Chandra, for those great remarks. And I'll turn it right over to Mike McGrath from Preservation Delaware.
Thanks, Michael. I am Mike McGrath, the president of Preservation Delaware, and I want to welcome each one of you logged in this evening for this very special panel discussion and exchange with you, our audience. Preservation Delaware is the statewide nonprofit concerned with protecting Delaware's historic and cultural resources. I like to say we're standing up for what's being torn down. It's our privilege to bring you conferences just like this one tonight, and we have others planned for the near future. For example, at our upcoming annual meeting in a couple of weeks, we will be putting on a 3-day series of online conferences covering a variety of current topics in preservation. You'll want to go to our website, preservationdE.org, or our Facebook page, and check out that unique annual meeting and conferences. I'm sure you'll find something there that will interest you. Please sign up. Then later in 2021, we are continuing our focus on climate change, sea level rise, and how these pressing worldwide problems are affecting historic resources and archaeological sites here in Delaware. We recently completed 2 such conferences featuring Dominic Hawkins, and they were well attended. Preservation Delaware believes that our history and historic resources are just not part of the past. They are an important part of our present and crucial to the success of our future. Delaware is unique among the states in many ways. Of course, we're the first state, and that historic distinction is something that can never be taken away from us. But just as critical today is the fact that among the 50 states, Delaware is, on average, the lowest lying of all the states and the most subject, therefore, to the impacts of climate change causing sea level rise. Thus, PDI's interest in this worldwide challenge. You see, we believe our quality of life here in Delaware depends on our protecting our historic and archaeological resources. They are what makes us who we are and what we look like, and what attracts so many people to our state. So you see, it's not just about the past, it's about the future too. Finally, to keep discussions like this one tonight free and available to the public, we need your help. I want to invite you to join us and become a member. Your annual dues at whatever level supports our work financially and adds your voice to our advocacy for our shared history. And why not make a donation to keep us standing up for what's being torn down? Just visit our website, preservationdE.org, and join in. Now to tonight's event. It was inspired by several historical monuments in Delaware that, for various reasons, were focal points for some sort of controversy in the past couple of years. So to kick off this roundtable discussion, I wanted to quickly introduce these monuments. The most visible in the news, especially after President Donald Trump's recent mention of it on the national stage, was the removal in June of the Caesar Rodney statue from Rodney Square in Wilmington. On the same weekend, the Christopher Columbus statue on Pennsylvania Avenue was removed. Of course, celebrations of Columbus have been criticized for years in light of the atrocities his men carried out against Native peoples. Many have pointed out that Caesar Rodney, for all his virtues, also owned several slaves. So amid rising protests for racial justice across the US, these statues were removed for safekeeping. In light of planned local protests, it was feared that they'd be vandalized. But Mayor Mike Przicki also made clear that a much needed discussion was overdue regarding the public display of historical statues and commemorative markers. We hope this event helps further that cause. But other Delaware monuments have been lightning rods for controversy too. The Delaware Confederate Monument on the grounds of the Georgetown Historical Society has drawn frequent criticism since it was installed in 2007, especially because it flies the Confederate battle flag next to Delaware's state flag. But last year, the museum's refusal to remove this monument from its grounds cost them financial support. The Delaware legislature refused to continue the museum's grant and aid funding, which had totaled almost $15,000. Petitions continue to call for that monument's removal, but to date, the Historical Society has refused. Also in Georgetown at the old Sussex County Courthouse, the last standing whipping post in the state of Delaware was removed after historians and community organizers challenged its display. Besides the fact it glorified violence, many pointed out that the whipping post was racially charged, since this cruel punishment was doled out disproportionately to Black people. The whipping post was moved into the historical collections of the Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs for future interpretation in a museum setting. Still, some complained about the removal on social media. And while state historical markers rarely prompt controversy, two in Newcastle County, both recognizing violence against Black Delawareans, have done just that. First, in 2017, a marker recognizing the Collins Park bombings in the 1950s, in which a Black family who had moved into a white neighborhood had their house blown up in two separate fire bombings, prompted complaints to the marker program that it was, quote, wrong to recognize these uncomfortable histories, and that it would only stir racial tensions. And just last year, a historical marker acknowledging the lynching of George White, a Black American who was tied to a stake and burned in 1903 near Wilmington, was ripped from the ground and stolen just a few weeks after its dedication ceremony. Undeterred, legislators and community leaders, as well as the high school student who initiated the commemoration, quickly replaced the marker with added security measures. But the theft of the first marker underscores the anger some people feel when atrocities against Blacks are commemorated as part of Delaware's complicated history. Obviously, these Delaware monuments do not exist in a vacuum, and debates continue across the United States about the fates of thousands of historical monuments. What is clear is that historical monuments have many layers of meaning, and that we need to consider all of these layers to uncover their many dimensions. It also is clear that we need to step outside our own shoes at times and consider what a monument might mean to people with backgrounds different from ourselves. So tonight, Preservation Delaware and the Center for Historic Architecture and Design at the University of Delaware are excited to host this roundtable. We want to open a dialogue to get us all thinking a bit deeper about Delaware's history and how to best commemorate and preserve it. Michael, I'm turning back over to you to introduce our panelists.
Great. Thank you to Chandra and to Mike. And thank you, Mike, for that nice overview of some of the controversial monuments or monumental controversies that spawned this discussion. That's a nice overview. And so I want to make clear, tonight we're going to be talking about historical monuments in a broader context. So some of the panelists' remarks may cover topics outside of Delaware, which helps us kind of put our own monuments in perspective. And hopefully they also shed light on our specific monument controversies. So with that, I want to get going right now with our panelist openings. Our first speaker is Dr. Sarah Beetham, who is the Chair of Liberal Arts and Assistant Professor of Art History at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, specializing in American art and particularly the monuments erected to citizen soldiers after the Civil War. She holds an MA and a PhD in art history from the University of Delaware. Her current book project, Monumental Crisis, considers the long history of damage and alteration of Civil War monuments in the context of recent debates over Confederate memory. She has been interviewed about monuments in several outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, Inside Edition, and NBC News. And so we're glad to have her joining us here tonight. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm so thrilled to be on this panel. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. All right, I'll pull up my remarks. My name is Sarah Beetham, and I have been researching and writing about Civil War monuments for more than 16 years. For much of that time, my work focused on how Civil War citizen soldier monuments, the ubiquitous soldier statues that stand in town squares north and south, were conceived, commissioned, erected, and celebrated. But in the fall of 2011, I came across the story of the Elbert County Confederate Monument, a granite statue that was torn from its pedestal in Elberton, Georgia, in the middle of a summer night in 1900. The work of an itinerant German-American stonecutter, the statue was supposed to be the first major product of Elberton's burgeoning granite industry. But when the statue was unveiled, town residents hated it for its ridiculous, wide-eyed expression, its heavy, stumpy body, and its northern overcoat. So after only 2 years on view, they attacked it and toppled it. After the fact, the event was discussed in the press with the language of a mock lynching, and the statue was ceremonially buried in the town square, only re-emerging in the 1980s. Researching this incident taught me 2 things. First, that monuments in public space are subject to change if they no longer meet the needs of their citizens. And second, that Confederate monuments are indelibly linked with the history of racist violence against people of color, and particularly Black Americans. Tonight, I will argue that monuments can and should be allowed to change, and that realigning our public spaces to reflect our shared values will make us stronger. Since discovering the story of the Elbert County Confederate Monument, and since the recent reckoning on public monuments that began after the Charleston church shooting in 2015, I have shifted the focus of my research on Civil War monuments. I now study the long history of their revision and removal. While the sheer number of monument removals in the past few months has been wildly unprecedented, they have long been subject to material change. Since their earliest appearance at the close of the war, Civil War monuments, both Union and Confederate, have been subject to the forces of public opinion, municipal expansion, criminal mischief, and physical environment. These statues are sited in public spaces with dynamic histories that influence their material circumstances. While conventional wisdom holds that a monument is meant to endure forever, the expression set in stone comes to mind, the reality could not be farther from the truth. Monuments in American cities are routinely destroyed by car accidents and weather events, defaced with vandalism, worn down through neglect and exposure, and recontextualized through changes in the surrounding landscape. In reality, the public monument is not an unchanging and unchangeable edifice, but a living document that responds to community needs and adapts to the surrounding landscape. In deciding the future of controversial statues, it is important to remember that monuments are recontextualized or relocated all the time, and that these processes are a natural part of the life cycle of a work of public art. If indeed monuments are actually meant to change rather than to endure forever, it is our responsibility as citizens to learn about and interrogate the ideologies they represent. I am often asked whether removing monuments is erasing history, and my response is that monuments are not and can never be history. Because of the time and expense necessary to erect these massive stone and metal structures, the messages they communicate are by nature narrowly representative of the people who could afford to commission them. In the case of Confederate monuments, this means supporting an ideology that hides the real causes of the Civil War and promotes the structural racism that is still so evident today. And many of the other monuments that have been challenged or removed this summer also perpetuate myths that keep us from holding honest conversations about our national history. I first became interested in acts of iconoclasm and accidental damage to monuments because of the ways in which these events take monuments that have faded into the background and throw them into sharp relief, forcing us to reckon with them. Talking about our shared past and deciding as a community how to deal with these powerful and problematic objects can only make us stronger. If we take a moment to come together, the current monument debate is an opportunity to listen to one another, to share our lived experience, and to build spaces that include all of us. Thank you, and I look forward to tonight's discussion.
Great, and thank you, Sarah, for that interesting introduction. That's thought-provoking. Our next speaker is Dr. Cheryl Renee Gooch, who's an historian, an author, and a museum educator. Her book, Hinsonville's Heroes, tells the story of Black Civil War soldiers of Chester County, Pennsylvania. Dr. Gooch has been a speaker for many Civil War groups, like the Civil War Roundtable Congress, the Baltimore Civil War Roundtable, and the Sons of Union Veterans Bradbury Camp. And she also advises the National Park Service on inclusive interpretive themes at battlefields, parks, and historic sites. She also served as historian and lead writer for the Delaware History Museum's well-known permanent exhibition, Journey to Freedom, which chronicles the Black Delawarean experience from 1629 to the present. So Cheryl, I will turn it over to you.
My screen is visible. Okay. So the activism we are experiencing will continue, I believe, to shape our conversation about our shared history and how we remember our shared history. As an educator, historian, and lifelong learner, I support the use of monuments, memorials, and places of memory that provide us a balanced, honest view of our shared history. The Delaware History Museum's core exhibit, entitled Delaware, One State, Many Stories, asks visitors a series of thought-provoking questions. One of these questions is at the core of our ongoing conversation about the often conflicting views of monuments, who and what they represent or do not represent, the stories they tell or do not tell. And are these stories honest and inclusive? The question, am I not a man and a brother, is illustrated here with this compelling image of an enslaved African imprinted on the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, which were framed and or signed by Delaware's founding fathers, including Caesar Rodney, John Dickinson, and George Reed, who championed independence while buying and selling human beings, possibly ancestors of thousands of living Delawareans. The question, am I not a man and a brother, still resonates within our conversations about who and which historical events we commemorate. Am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a woman and a sister, a Delawarean, an American? Do not all our representative stories warrant inclusion in monuments that tell and interpret our diverse Delaware story? Public monuments can be used to teach and improve our understanding of our complex history. Before it was removed last year during protests, this Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Baltimore, which was erected in 1902, had been updated to include interpretive panels. And these expanded panels were placed at that monument. They were based on research and extensive community input that placed this and similar monuments in Baltimore into documented historical context. The panels for this particular monument in part read, monuments like this one help to perpetuate lost cause tenets, which portrayed slavery as benign, secession as justified, and advocated for white supremacy. In the same period this monument was installed, Baltimore City adopted racial segregation housing ordinances and deed covenants, supported segregation policies in public spaces and programs, and unequally funded African-American school budgets, infrastructure improvements, and public programs. So this commission, which was quite successful and had broad community support and participation, raised similar questions relevant to our conversation here in Delaware. How can existing and future monuments and memorials present more honest, inclusive views of history? Equally important, how do we adjust our assumptions and attitudes about the role of activism in this process? This to conclude with an example here from Wilmington, Delaware, shows us how collaborative dialogues and efforts move us towards more inclusive historical remembrances, especially about aspects of our shared history that are not widely or formally taught. The Delaware State Historical Marker was placed at this Civil War Soldiers and Sailors Monument that was dedicated originally and in 1871. Note the presence of the Civil War reenactors, Army, Navy, Black, White. Some of the reenactors represent United States colored troops, the more than 200,000 Black men who fought among the Union forces to reunify our country and liberate 4 million Americans from slavery. Among those United States colored troops were between 2,000 and 5,000 men who were from or settled here in Delaware. In this vintage photo of descendants of the sons of veterans of the Civil War, which was taken around 1925 on the steps of the Wilmington, Delaware Library, is interesting. Members of the local branch of the Sons of Veterans of Civil War are actively researching for and about the descendants of the people who appear in this photograph as a community building effort to preserve this forgotten history. Returning to our question, do not all our stories of shared struggles for freedom, independence, equity, and justice warrant inclusion in our diverse Delaware story? Indeed, we're Delawareans with many stories. I thank you for participating and look forward to the dialogue soon to follow.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cheryl. That was great. And some more good fodder for our discussion here in a few minutes. I appreciate that. So next up is Dr. Scott Hancock, who is an associate professor of history and Africana studies at Gettysburg College. His scholarly interests focus on the African-American experience from the mid-17th century to just before the Civil War. He is particularly interested in how Black interactions with the law, from small disputes in lower courts to escaping via the Underground Railroad, shaped constitutional law, legal ideologies, Black identity, and U.S. society. His work has appeared in several anthologies like Paths to Freedom, We Shall Independent Be, and Slavery, Resistance, and Freedom, and more recently in the journal Civil War History. So with that, I will let Scott take it away. And you're muted, Scott, just so you know. I can see your mute button on.
All right, so let me share this. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Gettysburg, some of that other context. You all can see the Mississippi Monument, I assume. So this is Mississippi Monument at Gettysburg National Military Park. And a part of the controversy over monuments, as has been referenced by a few people, is that their removal may erase history as part of what often gets labeled cancel culture. And I understand why that removal of monuments criticism is often perceived that way, but I want to suggest another way of thinking about this that I think connects to what our other panelists have said. That actually it's the erection of monuments that often erases, cancels, and silences a great deal of history. And so using these two monuments as an example, so the Mississippi Monument, as you can see, it's quite dramatic and huge of this soldier defending his fallen comrade, a standard bearer. And the inscription on the Mississippi Monument says, "On this ground our brave sires fought for their righteous cause." So it's an inscription that has no context or explanation. Currently, it was erected in 1973. That hopefully is going to change soon, that it has more context. So it's an unchallenged assertion, although at the time it was actually challenged by then Superintendent George Emery. briefly. So the Mississippi Declaration of Secession from 1860 states, the reason they seceded said, "It is but just that we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. There is no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or dissolution of the Union." So there could be a sign similar to what President Gooch talked about it in Baltimore, and hopefully, I would argue, also another monument alongside this very dramatic monument that notes this history, because the monument as it stands now erases the history of what leaders in Mississippi were saying was the righteous cause. And likewise, we see a similar thing at the South Carolina monument at Gettysburg, which was erected in 1963 with Alabama Governor George Wallace as one of his main dedication speakers. And the South Carolina Declaration of Secession would be another contrast. So you can see here on this, it says that South Carolinians fought for the sacredness of states' rights. So that became part of the lost cause mantra, and we still hear that today. So the South Carolina Declaration of Secession has a long preamble, leads to its argument that justifies secession. And it says a key part of the compact that had been broken. And it's the one that the Declaration actually lists as first and basically the only example is it cites the 4th article of the US Constitution, which stated that escaping slaves, quote, "shall be delivered up on claim of party to whom such service or labor may due." And then the Declaration lists all the northern states and complains how these northern states have been passing laws outlining their own rights to limit how much they help capture fugitive slaves. And so the South Carolina Declaration says, "But an increasing hostility on part of the non-holding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations," the northern states. "Those states have assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of domestic institutions, have denied the rights of property established in the southern states. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who have remained have been cited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection." And so the great irony here of this monument talking about how South Carolinians were dedicated to states' rights, which when George Wallace gives his speech, he mentions how the South will continue to fight for constitutional individual rights and gets a standing ovation. And everybody knew he meant resist federal integration. The irony is behind this monument, so these mountains to the west here, we know that freedom seekers, escaping slaves, that some of them used those mountains to get to the north. That these were the very people that the South Carolinians in 1860 were complaining about, that the federal government wasn't actively using its power to suppress the rights of northern states. So this monument, like the Mississippi monument, not only silences history, but in this case actually flips it on its head. So this monument, if left stand for another 57 years since it was put up with no context, I would be all for trying to remove it, but I wonder if there's a way to use this monument like the one in Baltimore, especially because monuments on federal land are very difficult to remove. If there's a way to use this to teach that same kind of history about how this was in many ways used to simplify history, and if we can produce a better grounded understanding of our past and how history is complicated and it's always a battleground, and think about why it's a battleground and what that means for us today, might be a way to resolve some of the monument wars. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Scott. Another great opening for us and lots to think about. And yeah, the battlefield monuments versus the town square monuments, I think, is another interesting thing to possibly discuss. And I want to remind people, if at any point you can submit questions using the Q&A button at the on your Zoom toolbar. So our last speaker is Bill Hosley, who is a cultural resource development and marketing consultant, historian, museologist, and photographer. He is passionate about local history and historic preservation, and though he lives in Connecticut, he and his wife are both graduates of the Winneter program here in Delaware. He was formerly director of the New Haven Museum and Connecticut Landmarks, where he cared for a chain of historic attractions. Prior to that, as a curator at Wadsworth Atheneum, he organized major exhibitions including The Great River, Art and Society of the Connecticut Valley, and Sam and Elizabeth, Legend and Legacy of Colts Empire, which spawned the Coltsville National Park. He's been fascinated with gravestones and monuments since college and has sought out and photographed hundreds of monuments and public sculptures from Maine to Alabama and beyond. And Bill has pre-recorded his intro, so I will go ahead and load that and play that now, and then we will transition into our discussion.
I'm Bill Hossley and happy to be part of a public discussion of monument wars. I can't recall the last time an issue related to history, historic preservation, and art has been front page news. 1850 to 1910 was the golden age for representational statuary, from the World's Fairs to our first art museums. The statuary movement was the biggest wave of patronage for American art up to that time. The market exploded when 620,000 of a rising generation died in the Civil War. Many, if not most, Civil War monuments are located in cemeteries. Others are on town greens. The texts of monument dedication ceremonies tell us much about how they viewed the role of monuments in honoring sacrifices and restoring national unity. Dozens of Civil War battlefields are layered with monuments. Gettysburg, for example, is the largest sculpture park in America. Thousands of soldiers, north and south, are here at Shiloh Battlefield in Tennessee. National reconciliation involved recognition of shared grief and sacrifice. This is the Confederate monument at Shiloh. The United Daughters of the Confederacy raised money for statues and influenced how the war was interpreted in schools. The U.S. Postal Service issued countless commemoratives that put a spin on history. Monuments aren't as numerous in the South and are located in various places, not always on the grounds of courthouses or other public buildings. Many are in cemeteries like those in Fredericksburg and Tuscaloosa. Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, final resting place for 3 presidents, 28 CSA generals, and 18,000 enlisted men, memorialized by a 90-foot granite pyramid. The proliferation of Civil War monuments got Gilded Age Americans thinking of other aspects of history to commemorate, including personalities from the American Revolution. Many of the great names in 19th century American art, like Augustus St. Gaudens, built their careers on monument commissions. It is hard to imagine our national iconography without culturally defining landmarks like Daniel Chester French's Lincoln Memorial. Then came 2020 with the pandemic, social isolation, economic disruption, a contentious election, Western wildfires, the George Floyd incident, and the rise of the BLM movement. Protest leapt to vandalism and monument removal as the effrontery of Monument Avenue in Richmond became so vivid. So part of the challenge today involves understanding sources of oppression many did not see. Black Lives Matter, Black History Matters. It's been a powerful awakening. Then it sprawled into attacks against Christopher Columbus, Winston Churchill, George Washington, Philip Schuyler in Albany, which leaves many wondering how it got this crazy. For me, pause, discuss, and listen is better than vandalism and abrupt removal. We get it. Monuments valorize heroes. So who decides what's heroic or worth commemorating? These are discussions that warrant serious adult conversation, not mob action. Does making a distinction between those who led the Confederacy and the common soldiers who did most of the dying make sense? When removal is deemed necessary, there are ways to do it right, like the contextualization Jefferson Davis Monument at the Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas. Adding layers of interpretation through signage and video has never been more affordable. The African American History Monument on the grounds of the Capitol in South Carolina helps tell the rest of the story. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC is an astonishing museological achievement. There is no way forward without the learning and experience like this provides. The Whitney Plantation Museum in Louisiana focuses primarily on the lives of enslaved people. It is brilliant and evocative. I believe most monuments should be left in place interpreted and contextualized. I stand against iconoclasm, which refers to a recurring historical impulse to break or destroy images for religious or political reasons. From the Puritan iconoclasm of the British Civil War to the destruction of monuments and the looting of the National Museum by the Taliban, it's mankind at our ugliest. Presentism is defined as the introduction of present-day ideas into the interpretation of past events, as if the cultures then and now are the same. In my view, it's the offspring of narcissism, where individuals with a disproportionate sense of self-worth become antisocial and even violent. The key to life is embodied in Glenn Ligon's sculptural homage to Muhammad Ali's famous two-word poem, Me, We. It is also a prayer for this moment, getting from me to we. Moderation is called for. Pause, discuss, listen, and reflect with humility, humanity, compassion, and openness. America's journey of freedom has always been a work in progress, a struggle toward that more perfect union.
Another great opening piece there by Bill, which raises some issues and perspectives I don't think we've heard yet. So I'm glad to have those on the table as well. So I think we're running just a couple minutes behind schedule, so I don't want to take much more time here before transitioning right into our roundtable.
Welcome, everyone. My name's Amy Wynn, and I serve on the Connecticut Arts Alliance Board.
Sorry about that. YouTube transitioned right into another video. I guess it thought I wanted more. So I want to transition right into the roundtable discussion here. I know a couple of you addressed this, and I want to remind the panelists you're all muted, so make sure you're unmuting when you're answering or responding. A couple of you already addressed this, but I'm sure a lot of people tuning in kind of have this perspective. And so the first question I wanted to ask, which is actually based on a lot of things people were saying on social media with the removal of the Caesar Rodney statue and Christopher Columbus statues, does removing statues or monuments in any way erase history?
I'll break the ice. It seems like we're all waiting. I talked about this a little bit in my opener, but I've been asked this question by a lot of journalists, and pretty much every time I give a talk, I get asked this question. Personally, I would say no, because monuments and history are not the same thing. That monuments are works of art that come about from very long periods of discussion, of fundraising, of years and years of the artist working on the the design for it, back and forth with the committee, and then something is finally put up. Because of the fact that this takes so long, because of the fact that it is incredibly expensive, that it requires donations from very wealthy people, monuments can never represent what history actually is. Monuments could certainly tell us about what the values were of a certain group of people at a certain time, but they themselves are not historical texts. That's one area that I think tends to be a lot of confusion, but we shouldn't be thinking of them as history.
Can I politely disagree? Hello? Am I on?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the things that we embraced, an idea we embraced at Whittier was when my wife and I were students there, is that objects are documents. So that to remove an artifact, things get destroyed all the time, but it is kind of like burning manuscripts. I mean, it's a facet of history. And again, I would much rather interpret these things. There are conditions where removal makes sense, but I would almost always err on the side of caution and thoughtfulness before removal. And I do think that the removal craze, for lack of a better word, got way out of control this past spring. And I think that when the mayor of Wilmington or whomever talked about the need for a thoughtful discussion, when somebody finds a politician willing to lead such a discussion, call me.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? I wonder about, because, you know, as a historic preservationist and someone who contextualizes historic resources, I think I see your point that these as soon as a statue becomes 50 years old, it itself is considered eligible, possibly in and of itself, for the National Register of Historic Places. That's kind of, as you're saying, a historic artifact. But then Sarah made the interesting point, though, that these artifacts themselves are maybe, they have their own context, right? So the monument, the statue itself isn't the history, it's someone's celebration or commemoration or interpretation of that history. So does that make a difference?
I would, I understand, I think what Sarah's saying, and I would agree, I think, with her. But I think my question for you, Sarah, would be, is that how the average person who's not an academic sees those? Will they see that as not historical text, not history, and how would we communicate that to the public in general, what you're saying, in a way that's, you know, digestible easily when they're walking around a monument?
Well, I think that with the past 5 years have really borne out that that's something that's really possible to communicate with people. I've been working on this project on Civil War monuments for 16 years. And the amount of shift that I've seen in the kinds of questions that I get and the kinds of things that other people other than me are saying in the past few years has really been incredible. I think that during the course of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, historians did an absolutely fantastic job of completely, gutting the lost cause, which has been such a huge part of the way Americans think about the Civil War for so long, explaining why the lost cause was wrong, explaining where it came from, explaining what the real history was. And maybe not everybody has picked up on the message, but a lot of people have. Like the needle shift that I have seen on people understanding that the Civil War is about slavery, that the Confederacy was a completely bankrupt cause, has been incredible. I think some of the things that you were saying too, Scott, about the ways that the Confederate monuments actually themselves erased history by putting up these inscriptions that were completely untrue. When you really sit down with people and explain that, I think it's really possible to move the needle. And I think that what we've seen in the past couple of years has really borne that out.
This might be a similar question, so it might be a good one to throw in here then. So what is the difference between monuments or statues that educate versus celebrate? And is that part of the problem here, is the kind of the honoring figures who are controversial or have dark sides to their past? Is that the problem here? So what is the difference? How do monuments celebrate in a way that becomes maybe offensive versus being more didactic and teaching history? And that's for anyone, I should point out.
Well, I think that, as I said earlier, that the progressive elements of the activism that we are seeing and experiencing provide some answers to that question. What is the role of activism or community-based and driven dialogues about what is history, what is something that warrants celebration? So I reiterate the increasing, really burgeoning role of progressive, proactive activism and listening to communities and inviting diverse community stakeholders to this conversation, which is certainly beyond the confines of academia or historical preservation sector.
From an art historical standpoint, I'd argue that all monuments celebrate. That the distinction that might be helpful here might be thinking about what is a monument versus what is a memorial. And, you know, a lot more recently, a lot of the things that are being put up are called memorials instead. We talked about the 9/11 Memorial or the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, that these are sites that are meant for mourning, that are meant for, you know, thinking about these horrible events that occurred, that are meant for reflection. A monument is different from that. A monument is going to be vertical. A monument is going to borrow often from the language of antiquity, is going to borrow from ancient Greek and ancient Roman especially, language that was, you know, for Romans, this was the language of imperialism. It was the language of conquest. It was the language of, you know, bringing booty back from all the places that the Romans conquered. And that's the language that is used for American monuments. So putting a statue up on a pedestal is very Roman. Having an equestrian statue is very Roman. And so the very language is not educational, like, even if you haven't really thought about this, like, you know, when you're looking at a monument that it is celebrating the person on top of it, that they're not just telling you this guy existed, they're telling you this guy was special. That Robert E. Lee monument that's 90 feet tall in Richmond is telling you that that guy is special. And so the language here is absolutely one of celebration, and that is exactly the problem.
Well, but then there are examples. I showed one from Concord, Mass, and another from Waterbury, Connecticut, that are so earnest. And I mean, to read Ralph Waldo Emerson's speech at the dedication of the Concord Monument sort of brings tears to your eyes. I mean, it was really honoring the common soldier, the people that did all the dying in these wars. And so I think there's, yeah, of course, the point about generals on horses is a different kind of thing, but I think there's a lot of variety within the monument genre, the Civil War monuments at least, and that some of them have not only earnestness to them, but real timeless beauty. I mean, I think not just aesthetically, but that there is a feeling that we would benefit to reconnect with.
Yeah, and George Curtis's speech at the Concord dedication was even better. You know, the Civil War monuments were originally created to deal with exactly what you're talking about, or to deal with the fact that, you know, 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War. On the Union side of the soldiers who died, only 50% of them were ever identified. So many families were left wondering what had happened to their young men. Their bodies are buried all over, mostly all over the South, and they became cenotaphs and cemeteries for the soldiers who were lost. This is true certainly in the North, where statues are being built pretty much right after the war, but it is also true to a certain extent in the South, where in the first 15 years, the biggest effort is trying to find all the soldiers who were buried all over the place and putting them into these cemeteries. But the problem, I think, with the Confederate monuments especially is that most of them are not in cemeteries. Most of them then get built in town squares and get built right in front of the county courthouses, places that are the sites of all kinds of absolutely horrific acts of racism, acts of violence. You know, lynching is very much associated with that same courthouse space. Today, those courthouses are still being used for all kinds of government things. And if you are someone who has just been, you know, has to go to the courthouse because of something for which you were racially profiled and you have to walk past the Confederate monument, that is incredibly powerful. And that is something that is going to affect you. And it says something about our, you know, continued governance and about who our government is really for today. And that's really the problem. It's not so much the issue of, you know, what the monuments were originally intended to be. And if people wanted to take every one of those Confederate monuments and put them back in the cemeteries next to the bodies of Confederate soldiers, that would be fine with me. But the problem is the site. The problem is that they're in public spaces.
A great many of them are not in public spaces, I'm sure.
Most of them are actually.
I've only
Many more than the cemeteries.
I've only seen 40, and I would say 10 of them are in cemeteries. That's not very mathematical.
Yeah, there's about 500 Confederate soldier statues, and most of them are in public spaces.
Okay, I believe that.
You guys kind of both touched on, especially Bill, something I want to throw out there, which, you know, the political divide in our country, the partisanship, it goes beyond partisanship, right? You guys can hear me, correct? It it's obviously a really, really tough time for our country. I think the debate last night highlights the differing perspectives on where we want to go as a nation. So I think a lot of people are see the removal of our historical monuments, and as Bill touched on, it's moved beyond Confederate monuments, right, to even be Revolutionary War heroes like Caesar Rodney or Philip Schuyler or whoever. So what about people that say at this time as a nation, we need to find a way to find common, brotherhood's the word I'm looking for, but I want to use a more gender neutral term, but you know what I mean? A shared sense of patriotism, a shared sense of who we are as a people, as the United States of America. So, and I think that's probably where a lot of the anger comes from. I mean, there's a video of Scott at the Robert E. Lee Monument on YouTube trying to put up Black Lives Matter flags around the Robert E. Lee statue. It just gets berated by this crowd of protesters. And I wonder, why can't both of those messages survive at the same time, right? So, but I think that's where that anger must come from. So I guess my question, so I'll stop doing a monologue here. My question is, is there a threat to kind of our shared patriotism if we remove a lot of our historical statues or reinterpret them? Does that somehow erode the foundation of our understanding of who we are as Americans?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that. I would argue it doesn't have to be. And there's a part of the premise to that question that comes up a lot. And I think a sense of civic identity for any nation, any society can be useful and can be important. And we have to be careful about, whether we're public historians, academics, writers, journalists, whatever, about how we go about critiquing that in a way that's helpful. But there's a premise to that, I think, Michael, that often we ask that question, is this damaging our patriotism, civic identity? People weren't asking that question to Black folks 50 years ago, right, or 100 years ago. That's really a question that arises when the dominant group feels like they're being the ones, that their position of advantage or influence is being threatened. That's when that question seems to come up the most. That doesn't mean it's not a legit question to ask. But I would argue there are ways in which we can tell stories about the ugly realities as well as the wonderful realities of our past that complicate the story. And instead of running away from complexity actually opens up more avenues for more people to enter into the story and think about, so what does it mean to be an American? And the fact that talking about the United States, so what does it mean that we keep wrestling with this question about how we make the country live up to its ideals? So there are ways this discussion and this debate about statues and monuments is really useful. Bill, I agree with some of what you said. When you said the monument craze, I kind of know what you mean, but one part of that, I think that characterization for me suggests that it's an irrational response. And I would argue it's not an irrational response of these bringing down the monuments. And part of it, gets at this question you're asking, Michael, as people are trying to rethink. I wrote down the quote, I think, Sarah, you said at the beginning about that monuments change if they no longer meet the needs of its citizens. So we need to be asking, well, so what does this mean about what citizens in America are say that we need now?
Yeah, I agree with so much of what Scott just said. For one thing, I think, patriotism is something that certain groups of America have claimed that it's theirs, when really patriotism is something that belongs to all of us. And patriotism can have lots of different forms. And I would argue that looking for a way of thinking about United States history that thinks about all of the parts of it, that thinks about everyone being included, that thinks about telling everyone's stories, and thinks about trying to get us to live up to the ideals of the founding documents that were created, as imperfect as they were, is in itself a really powerful form of patriotism. And so that in a lot of ways, the discussions that we're having, if we can be allowed to have them, are patriotic. Another thing that I have noticed in a lot of my own research. And one of the reasons that I always start out by talking about all of the ways that monuments are changed that we don't hear about, you know, the car accidents, the hurricanes, the monuments that are moved to build parking lots, the fact that so many American monuments are built in the middle of intersections and that get hit by the cars all the time, and they need to all get moved out of the intersections because that's stupid. Nobody knows how to drive in a traffic circle. And what I've noticed is in the cases where monuments are hit by cars, which happens all the time, because of the fact that that wasn't on purpose, and because of the fact that, you know, one day the monument was there and the next day a minivan came by and it was smashed, that people are surprised and then they have to have a conversation. And what they often realize is that their assumptions about what their neighbor thought about that monument are completely wrong. And that maybe, you know, say for white citizens in the South, they might have thought that nobody objected to this monument. And then they suddenly find out that when it comes to trying to spend money on rebuilding it after it's been knocked down by a car, a lot of other folks might say, hey, maybe not, maybe we shouldn't do that. The places where I've seen the most positive conversation have been in those car accident towns, where people have had really unpleasant conversations in town meetings where they've all come together, and some people said, you know, my granddad was a Confederate monument while my granddad was enslaved, and been able to come together and hear from each other and come up with a solution. Some of the solutions are really wonky and kind of, you know, inelegant, but coming up with those wonky and elegant solutions have allowed that community to kind of heal in a way that I think is really positive, which is why I said that, you know, having this discussion, no matter how ugly it gets, can really make us stronger as people.
Well, you know, either way, I think we're at a point where I hope most people agree that we need to figure out how to put the unum back in e pluribus unum, that this is a very divided country at the moment. And I know the P word, patriotism, has been out of unfashionable for quite a while, and I don't generally use it, but the question about national pride, for me, I mean, I think all history is local, so I have no trouble being really engaged and serious about the things that make the places I am involved in special, or that tell their stories. Most of history is written from the top down about national affairs, when to me the history that is most interesting is local. But nonetheless, national pride maybe comes from people more engaged in caring about the stories of their own communities. But one way or another, we need it, I think. And I'm not sure that a wave of monument removals is going to help foster national pride. It might help thoughtfulness, and we certainly need that as well.
Okay, so I guess one question that I might ask is, you know, how do we find middle ground in these monument debates? Because it really seems polarized, right? You're either on the side of, yeah, remove the Caesar Rodney statue from Rodney Square in Wilmington, this very visible profile of our state hero, who is not only on that statue or has Rodney Square named after him, but is also on our state quarter. That's, for people tuning in from outside of Delaware, that's who's on the state quarter. That's who's on a lot of our subdivision signs. You're either for removing him completely, I mean, schools are named after him, or keeping him in place and celebrating him. So how do we find a middle ground?
Well, I don't support removal and cancellation across the board. And I somewhat disagree that the terms patriotism and national pride are archaic. I think they've been with us across diverse communities and through the generations, but they've been defined somewhat narrowly. So again, the activism in some cases, in many cases, increasingly has gotten ahead of these types of conversations. But again, let's credit the progressive activism and its role in redefining, perhaps expanding what patriotism means. Listen, what do our diverse communities say about patriotism and national pride, and how has that been demonstrated across the centuries? And I think it will, of course, be quite enlightening and informative, and create an opportunity for all of us to revisit some assumptions about what patriotism is, how it's been defined, and what national pride is how, yes, even protesters and activists demonstrated in bringing these issues to the fore.
To piggyback off of Cheryl a little bit, something else I want to just add to the conversation too is that what happened this summer didn't come out of nowhere. That there's actually a longer history of this. First of all, a much longer history of this, which is that, at least when it comes to Confederate monuments, that they were never accepted by everyone. That there was always protest. If you go and look at the black newspapers in Richmond on the day that Robert E. Lee's statue was put up in 1890, they are full of protest. So first of all, that this is never monolithic. But second of all, that since 2015, which is when the horrible church shooting took place in Charleston, not only have there been increasing calls to remove Confederate statues, but there have been moves by state governments in the South especially to pass monument protection laws that make it impossible for cities to be able to remove their own statues. So that, you know, if the best stories are local and if the best conversations are local and people should make their own decisions about their own cities, what happened since 2015 is that power was taken away from the cities. We saw kind of an escalation of that with Charlottesville in 2017. But all this time, there have been all kinds of cases going through the courts trying to get those monument laws repealed and trying to do the work really slowly. There was a big case in Charlottesville that was going to the state Supreme Court. There was a case in Alabama. Charlottesville was arguing based on the 14th Amendment. Alabama was based on the First Amendment. And so this has been happening the whole time. And what happened with those state laws is they made it impossible for any kind of measured, nuanced conversation to take place. They made it impossible for people to come up with the middle grounds. They even, in some cases, banned putting up plaques to recontextualize. They really took away all of the reasonable solutions. And then if you add together the anger of the pandemic, the anger of everyone, you know, watching that video of George Floyd being killed was so upsetting. You know, the economic issues, the polarization that's been coming really from the top down in our government. What happened this summer was a reaction to all of that and also to the fact that all reasonable solutions have been taken away. So I think step one is making reasonable solutions possible again. Taking away the state laws that are preventing anyone from talking to each other and letting cities sit down and work this out. That's really what needs to happen. And Wilmington should be sitting down and working this out for themselves.
And hopefully those discussions, Bill, you're muted, just so you know.
Delaware doesn't have any law against removing statues, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And I mean, I don't know. The Caesar Rodney thing is bewildering to me, but that's neither here nor there. Look, something right down the street. You know, the John Dickinson plantation in Dover. One of the most, in my opinion, underreported stories is something that museologists, preservationists should and could all be proud of. One of the most underreported stories of the past quarter century is the phenomenal transformation of understanding of the African experience, African-American experience through sites like the John Dickinson plantation. And there are, you know, over the past 15 years or so, I think the National Museum of African-American Culture and History in Washington is one of dozens of really important breakthrough museum experiences that bring a whole range of important historical topics and acts and individuals forward. But also it cites, you know, again, like George Washington's Mount Vernon. When I first visited there years ago, you know, you take a house tour, you'd see the pretty furniture. You were done in an hour. You can spend all day at Mount Vernon now, and a lot of the content that they put forward has to do with the experience of the, you know, enslaved people there. So I think we're getting there, and it's something that the museum profession ought to be proud of. Actually, that we've been on the vanguard of this additive, transformational knowledge base.
And I think it probably comes down to people have different perspectives on what's fast enough for social change, right? So with that, I want to turn it over. I didn't even notice just how many questions have built up from our audience. And so I want to turn this over as soon as possible here to my colleague, Catherine Morrissey, who's the Associate Director at the Center for Historic Architecture and Design, who is going to give some of these questions from the audience to our panel.
Great, thank you so much. And as Michael mentioned, we have gotten a number of questions, so I'm going to do my best. So I apologize. I am probably going to crudely smash some together. So if I have slightly ruined your question, I apologize. I'm trying to get the most broad type of questions out there. One of the themes that has come up a lot in the Q&A has been this idea of how do we contextualize these monuments for the time period they went in? And maybe this is also tied to this idea of reinterpretation, right? Can these monuments be viewed as objects in motion through time, as each successive waves of viewers sees them differently than how they were originally installed? And is there a way to achieve kind of a reinterpretation, a resetting of these kind of public monuments with another plaque maybe about what the time period was that it was created, right? I think Bill mentioned most of these, especially Confederate monuments, went up from 1880s to the 1920s. And this is obviously during a lot of nationalization and Americanization movements in the United States. So is there a second plaque that accompanies the monument? Or are these things that can't be reinterpreted properly to the public? And so I'll leave that very kind of mashup of many, many different questions with our panelists.
I'll say, just to throw out there, I think we're past plaques. That from an art historical standpoint, like, you know, using the Lee Monument in Richmond again. It's 90 feet tall. Certainly now it's been recontextualized with all the graffiti that's on top of it. That's like now really successful, like that monument has been disrupted in a way that you go and look at that and you know that nobody, not everyone agrees with what that monument is communicating. But before that had happened, imagine a 90-foot statue of Robert E. Lee and like a 3-foot plaque that says, "We don't like Robert E. Lee." Which one do you believe? Do you believe the 90-foot statue or do you believe the 3-foot plaque? There's just really, unless you're going to completely disrupt the monument, unless you're going to knock it over, unless you're going to write something all over the base of it, unless you're going to cover it up with a tarp, or you know, do something that actually disrupts that physical space, over time the plaque is going to fade away and the memory of the monument is what's going to happen. So whatever solution that we're going to come up with, it's probably going to have to be something other than a plaque.
I would concur with that. To Gettysburg National Military Park, one of the things that they have said publicly that they'll be doing is putting markers by the Confederate state monuments, not the brigade and regimental markers, which are different, they're more educational, but putting markers about them, about some of the things that I was talking about, like in Mississippi and South Carolina. And I think that's important. It's an important first step because it educates visitors about the history of why those monuments were put up, when they were put up, and what was going on, and how they're connected to resisting federal mandates to dismantle, legalize racist Jim Crow in the South. But as much as I support that, and conversations had with the National Park Service people here, who are great here, is exactly what you're saying, Sarah. Is, you know, a 4-foot sign can't compete with 41-foot Virginia State Monument with Robert E. Lee on top with Traveler, like that Mississippi Monument, which is so dramatic. The sculptures are great, like what Bill was saying before. I mean, the Confederate State sculptures at Gettysburg are the best ones on the battlefield, in my opinion, my uneducated opinion on that score. But and Dr. Cheryl, I was wondering when you showed the Baltimore one, because you said there are panels around there. I was looking at the landscape around it because it looked a bit overgrown, and I was wondering, I mean, do you know if people, how they interact with the plaques? Because what you've done there is exactly what I hope they do here, but it seems like it's just a first step.
I live in Wilmington, Delaware. I do not reside in Baltimore, but I had occasion to directly interact with that monument. And that was several years ago. And frankly, colleagues, it transformed my whole thought process about the impact of object-based learning and how even I had certain assumptions and thoughts about Confederate monuments until I encountered that Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Monument and began to interact with that expanded interpretive panel. So for me, that was transformative. As an educator, here's a monument, a memorial, give me an app, I have a global classroom. But so I think though with Baltimore, with Wilmington, with Georgetown and beyond, it's really going to be about how each community approaches the opportunity to reimagine those spaces, whether that monument is retained or not. What are some of the interpretive spaces that can be created to engage visitors like me? And please, let's encourage our fellow citizens to back away from the default assertion, oh, just put them away somewhere in a museum, right? So museums are also public spaces where folks like me on our way to work or to an appointment can interact with the art, the monuments, and these memorials. So again, Baltimore, I don't know what their future is regarding this, but they did have a process, and I think it warrants some study for, how other communities might approach it. They had, a commission, they had extensive community input, and frankly, I think it was quite successful. Unfortunately, because of Charlottesville and the more negative and sometimes violent protests and activities that occurred, cities, including Wilmington, were prompted to remove some of the monuments for the moment. But each community has an opportunity to reimagine those spaces that may or may not include the monuments.
Well, Cheryl, thank you. The put it in a museum meme is just patently absurd. There's no money to do it. The museums don't often have space. Some might be able to incorporate some of these things, but that to me was a classic example of politicians kicking the can on making hard decisions in a tough situation.
Well, politicians and members of the community, because of somewhat limited understanding and awareness of what museums are and what museum spaces can be.
Yeah, right.
And Bill, that's one place where we can definitely agree that they're huge. They're such big things, and the museums don't have doors big enough to fit them or elevators big enough to move them. They're a huge problem. They could crack the floorboards. There are some great examples. The Briscoe Center that you mentioned, Bill, I think is a good example of one where they've really done something very thoughtful. There was also, I think it's the Museum of African American History and Culture, I think in Houston, just took one on and did something very interesting with it. They put it in their courtyard. They built a really high wall around it so you can't see it from the street and put a contemporary art installation. So there are interesting things that I think museums can do, but like imagining that the America's museums are going to absorb hundreds of these things is completely insane.
All right. So, and this is another question for all panelists. So what are some of the best practices for involving the community members in discussion about monuments and their reinterpretation or potential removal? And does anyone on the panel know of any success stories that could offer good models to follow for obviously the groups in Delaware dealing with this right now?
The case in Demopolis, Alabama is a good one to look into. And that was one of the car accident ones. And there's a really terrific story that was written up about it in the Washington Post. I think it happened in 2017. But if you Google Demopolis, Alabama, that was plowed over by somebody who didn't know how to drive in a traffic circle. The statue was smashed into several pieces. It really wasn't fixable. There was a lot of public comment. There were several meetings that were held. I think that the decision was actually in the hands of the town council. So these things are always going to be, depending on your local town, whose job it is to decide is always going to be different. But the council held several meetings where they had an open mic and they let people from the community come and talk about everything that they had to say about the monument. And the ultimate decision, which I think is a little bit clunky, but that's what they decided to do, was they kept it in the town's, at the base, and then they put a new obelisk on top of it and converted it into a monument for veterans of all wars. And I don't know if everybody felt 100% good about that, but at least it was a compromise solution that people were able to come together. And also just in general, a really interesting story. The Post article that was written about it when it first happened is fantastic. So it would be one I would point to look at.
I don't know how far they've gotten with it, but Christina Vita, a friend, is curator at the Valentine Museum in Richmond, and Valentine himself was a sculptor of statuary. Great museum, and my understanding is that Richmond is, a little bit after the fact, but is engaged in these conversations. And when you look at the Monument Avenue, whether it's, I don't know, it's Stonewall Jackson or Robert E. Lee, but the images of the graffiti covered monuments transformed that artifact into something that should be preserved somewhere and will be of fascination to people thousands of years after we're gone. And for a whole bunch of reasons we can't predict. I mean, that is got to me to be one of, I understand the emotion, I understand the sentiment, I understand even the logic of it, but it would be very hard to explain that to future generations.
And picking up on that, oh, sorry, Bill. Picking up on that,
I think the Valentine Museum may be in a very good position to do that.
So picking up on this idea of vandalism, one of the questions we did get from the audience is, how do you all feel about leaving vandalism on these monuments as a record of this kind of moment that has transpired in 2020?
I'm for it. I think it's a significant historical layer that's been added onto these objects. And I think too, when you look back into the past at vandalized or iconic objects that have experienced iconoclasm that have been kept, there's a certain really interesting aura about them that is really incredible that it's been preserved. And one example I'm thinking of is in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, where there is a block of marble that was saved from the Roman Empire. And on one side of it is kind of just like a standard carving of some soldiers related to the Emperor Trajan. But on the other side of it is a crossed out inscription dedicated to the Emperor Domitian. And it's an example of Roman damnatio memoriae. Domitian was one of those cursed emperors. They tore down all of his statues. They tried to destroy every single thing, but they're Roman, so they're really practical. So they basically took this piece of marble and turned it around and used the other side and built a different monument out of it. They did the best they could to destroy the inscription, but if you look at it in raking light, you can still read it. And so how fabulous is it that we have this example of how the Romans dealt with people they didn't like, or this incredible history. And now we have these objects in the United States that really hold on to that same kind of history. So I think it's an important layer that should be kept in at least some cases.
I think one caveat, so there are ways in which I think it's really useful. There's a monument in Lancaster, England, that's owned by the Lancaster Priory Church, and it's to a slave trader, because a lot of their wealth and the built structures in that area in Liverpool was a result of the slave trade. And somebody graffitied on it "slave trader" in red paint. And the church so far has decided to leave it there because they said, well, it's accurate. And I don't know if they'll continue to do that. And there's ways in which, like the one in Richmond, when I see pictures of that, I think, man, that's great. I agree completely with what you're saying, Sarah. But then I think, okay, if somebody put graffiti on the monument to USC troops in Vicksburg or the MLK statue in DC, I would not want that to stay because I suspect that graffiti would be racist. And I think the easy accusation is somebody could say, well, you're being inconsistent, perhaps. I would argue you could come up with criteria, right? Because a lot of that stuff that's on the Lee statue, so the Black Lives Matter, or this one in the Lancaster Priory Church, we can document historically, like this guy in Lancaster was a slave trader. So, and that's also on private property, so that's a different issue. I suspect if somebody's going to put graffiti on the MLK statue in DC, it would be racist graffiti. So then we have to think about, going back to your question earlier, so does this line up with, and with the question you asked Michael, does this line up with how we want to define ourselves as a nation? And I know there's never a simple answer to that. So there's some graffiti that I would agree completely. It's a historical moment. It's history in itself. But then there's some others that I would argue, well, I'm not sure I would be okay with certain things remaining.
Well, but if somebody went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and spray painted a slave owner on Washington crossing the Delaware, I'm not sure that graffitiing monuments is any different than spray painting a painting in an art museum. I mean, to me, these things are artifacts, and I don't know. It's complicated. I don't know what to say. Those pictures horrify me.
I think the difference is that monuments are in public space.
How much more public?
But the Met is a private, is to a certain extent a
private.
somewhat public institution. Certainly New York City supports the Met, but the Met is still like an indoor, semi-private space, whereas public space belongs to all of us. And that's really what the fundamental thing that it comes down to is that these spaces outdoors that are in our town squares are spaces that belong to all of us and that all of us are implicated in, that are connected to our government. And therefore, we should all get a say in what's there. And that's the problem, is that when there's monuments that are there that represent a very small part of the population, or specifically threaten certain parts of the population, as Confederate monuments certainly do, that presents a fundamental problem. One of the arguments that has been, that was being tried to overturn the monument laws was a 14th Amendment law saying that, when these Confederate monuments are in front of public spaces, that violates some people's rights to citizenship, because they are in front of the places where you go to exercise your right to citizenship.
Absolutely fair
And
enough.
so there is a huge difference between something that is sanctioned by the state and is in front of a government building versus something that's being held in a private collection.
We have a situation in Connecticut. Our state capitol, which was built in the 1870s, I haven't been to every state capitol, but I've been to 30 of them, and is more covered with statuary and sculpture than any other state capitol I've ever seen. Some of the personalities literally on the state capitol, of course, they're potentially controversial because they are people from past generations who lived in times different than our own, whose values may have been different than our own. And I don't think it would get to this, but the idea of chiseling some of the iconography off the Capitol horrifies me. And that's the most public building you could imagine. And there are absolutely features of it that somebody would find objectionable. I don't know what to do.
Okay, so as we are wrapping up the roundtable this evening, so moving forward, how should we best go about deciding what monuments are removed, what monuments are reinterpreted, or which ones are left alone? Is there a process that we should follow, and what criteria should we consider?
Cheryl,
We
you can't be
can't
heard.
hear you, Cheryl. Oh.
You're not muted, but we can't hear you, Cheryl.
Sorry. I really want to hear that answer too.
Yeah, does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Because I think that's the most important question we could really conclude with, right? Is moving forward, how do we decide what to do with these? What criteria or processes should we use to decide? And can this be a healing thing where communities come together instead of just a contentious thing? So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well, this is, go ahead, Cheryl, since we got your
Am
sound.
I still muted?
No, we can hear you.
Oh, great. All right, I'm back. Thank you. So I said, I think first we might continue initiate these conversations with a different question, rather what should stay, what should be removed, but beginning, and I'm really speaking to the non-academic, the broader diverse community here in our cities, states, and across the country, is what is our shared history? How do we want to recall our shared history? How do we begin to explain and reimagine what that shared history is? And then how can monuments, memorials, markers, and places of memory be recontextualized to reflect as much as possible glimpses of that shared history? And I think shared history and respect for diverse perspectives is a beginning, rather than what should be canceled or removed.
And one way to do that, and it doesn't perhaps exactly answer the question, what's the criteria for removal, is thinking about what we add. And there's a part of me as a historian, especially thinking about Sarah's talking about, that I'm really hesitant about advocating for adding monuments, memorials, because they're just often problematic. But in terms of disrupting, I think at Gettysburg, West Confederate Avenue, where all the Confederate state memorials are, and thinking about how these plaques are important, but they're not sufficient. Disrupting the narrative that has been told for 150 years on the Gettysburg battlefield by having statues, memorials, creative ones, maybe not just a standard statue, that about the Black presence, about the reality that the cause of the Civil War was slavery, that there were 10,000 slaves in the battlefield that the Confederate Army brought with them, that they kidnapped free Black people as they retreated from Gettysburg. If you can figure out a way to disrupt that narrative by having things that compete on an equal level, then it does some of what you're talking about, Cheryl, right? It invites more people into the story in creative ways that's not just destructive. So.
Yeah, and I would, echo both Cheryl and Scott and say that, the goal is getting as many people included as possible, to, hearing, how our public space is affecting people. And also, I think, to give local communities as much leeway as possible to make their own decisions. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say, Confederate monuments should go, but signers shouldn't, or signers should go and Confederate monuments should go, and Christopher Columbus should go, but my own Lincoln should stay. Like, I'm not going to make that decision. But I think that the people who really need to decide are the people who have to deal with their monuments in their communities every day and have to live with them every day. Should have as much leeway as possible to decide what goes into their public space.
If somebody knows of a situation where a mayor or somebody in the political class, when these moves to remove erupted, said, stop, we know this matters. We need to pause, reflect, discuss, codify, and then maybe act. I would love to know if there was a single incident of that. I think part of my frustration is the political class almost unanimously just caved and didn't actually interject the need for debate and discussion before they acted.
I think that's the goal. But there's a part of me that thinks, well, okay, but we've had 150 years of the opposite, right? That has reinforced monuments that have just been a glorification and an erasure, a glorification of whiteness and an erasure of Blackness. And we haven't even talked about Native Americans in this story, right? And other groups of people. So Bill, I agree, but there's a part of me that thinks it's frustrating to hear people calling for moderation now, because I want to say, well, we've had 150 years of no moderation. And I don't think that means we should abandon it now, but there's a part of it that somehow just seems a bit out of balance.
But I mean, the point that was made about the 200,000, apropos of nothing, last night my wife and I watched Glory again, and I don't know, maybe I'm just a sucker, but the tears rolled down my cheeks. And, that was 1989, and that's great. There's so much we don't know about the Civil War, but what we do know is that hundreds of thousands of white people from the North lost their lives. Look, I may be clueless, but I can't remember a time when I ever wasn't aware that the Civil War was about slavery. I mean, I think there maybe have been pockets of denial, and I understand the lost cause narrative, and the whole concept of states' rights, but who's kidding who? Everybody has known it was about slavery, and there are many facets that need to be added, and I think in some cases have been added. I would hate to see ethnic, whatever the word is, not ethnic, cultural cleansing of Gettysburg.
Yeah, I'm not looking for cultural cleansing, but actually I would disagree deeply that everybody knew that, and that there's pockets of people who didn't know that the war was about slavery. And surveys of high school students taking AP US history classes, the majority of them do not identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War.
What do they say is?
States' rights.
States' rights, a host of other things, but so the Confederacy has won the cultural and mental battle over.
Exactly.
Fascinating. I mean, I'm genuinely, respectfully fascinated because I didn't grow up in the South. I don't know. I mean, not to say it's only there, but I don't recall that.
You had a good education then.
All right. Well, with that, we're already 5 minutes over, so I don't want to keep our panelists or our audience longer than the promised time here. So I think this has been a really great discussion, a really robust discussion with lots of different viewpoints and interesting perspectives. I know it made me think quite a bit. A couple people pointed out that we didn't dive as deeply into any of the specific Delaware monuments as they had hoped, but I think in some ways this has been more valuable. I think we have really, you guys did a great job shining a light on lots of ways we need to think about these monuments wherever they are. And I think the key thing is we need to have informed civil discussion about these things. And we need to, and I think Bill would say too, like, right, it does seem like we're just hiding from these discussions and not having them. And it almost feels like it needs to be a kind of local political process for all these different monuments, wherever they are, if they're on public property. And we need to have measured discussion involving lots of different perspectives and come up with criteria on how to decide what to do with these things, and actually do this as policy, do this as process in a way that's orderly and the community has decided together after listening to lots of voices. So I think that's been a super valuable thing you guys have shown a light on here tonight. So I really appreciate everyone's perspective. I wanted to point out, there were 46 comments and questions coming in, and so Kate had to just mash up quite a few of them, and there were others we just couldn't get to. Mike McGrath, the president of Preservation Delaware, wanted me to point out, we might even try to post this in such a way on the Preservation Delaware website where some of those other questions maybe can be listed on there, and maybe we could even send a few of them to our panelists if they have time to respond to a couple of them. So maybe some of these other questions we couldn't get to can get a response. And so do be watching the Preservation Delaware website for that in the future. So thank you so much again for everyone, to our panelists, for all the people that tuned in. This has been great. And till then, we'll talk to you next time.
Over and out. Thanks.
Good night.